Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. I'm so delighted to have a good friend and a very smart person as our guest today. His name is Bennett Wright. He's the executive director of the Alabama Sentencing Commission, which is an appointed position by our Supreme Court Justice. Bennett, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tommy.
You've been on before, but it's been many years ago.
Yes, sir.
Because we are coming up on our 13th anniversary, I think, I can't believe it. I think my hair was black back then. I'm not sure. It's certainly not anymore, but it has not been combed since then. I will promise you that. So I get criticized about that by some of my relatives, but just one of those things. Tell us how you got to this position, and then we'll ask you what this position entails. So why don't you take it over from there?
Well, thank you, Tommy. I'm not a native of Alabama. I'm a native of Montana. I went to graduate school at Auburn. Had the opportunity to teach at Auburn for a few years. Left and went to the administrative office of the United States Courts in Washington, D.C. to help with the federal judiciary, and then had the opportunity to come back to Alabama and was hired on at the Sentencing Commission and was originally appointed director by Sue Bell Cobb.
Well, Sue Bell I've tried to get her on our show. Last week, before this taping, we had their new executive director, Judge Pulliam, on, talk about redemption earned and what they are doing. But what your organization or association does is not the same.
Correct.
Distinguish it for the audience.
Sure. Well, we were originally, the genesis behind the Alabama Sentencing Commission was then Attorney General Bill Pryor, who's now the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit United States Court of Appeals. And Judge Pryor envisioned the Alabama Sentencing Commission first analyzing all the available data and information in the state of Alabama to see how sentencing worked in the state, to identify what were the significant factors, to identify any places of unwarranted disparity. And that's how initially we landed with the first set of voluntary sentencing guidelines in 2006 and ultimately resulted in presumptive sentencing guidelines for nonviolent offenses in 2013. The overall mission of the sentencing guidelines, or as we call them in Alabama, sentencing standards, is not to tie judges' hands, but to provide more uniformity across the state to really ensure that someone's sentence is more a result of the crime they committed and their previous history more so than where they were convicted and the individual judge that actually sentences them.
So 2 questions come to mind. First of all, sentencing guidelines were created in the federal system first, and then states started to follow. The intent behind them was to see that people that committed a crime in Montana and in Alabama that were the same or close to the same were receiving similar sentences because there was tremendous disparity, and their goal was to eliminate disparity. That is also the goal with the state sentencing guidelines. However, you use the term presumptive. What does that mean?
Sure. So I mentioned the voluntary sentencing guidelines, and it's just that. Judges for violent offenses such as murder, rape, robbery, etc., they're required to consider the sentencing guidelines, but they're not required to follow those sentencing guidelines. For nonviolent offenses such as theft of property, drug possession, etc., the courts are required to follow our sentencing guidelines unless there are exceptional factors that have to be proven that then allow a court to sentence outside. But in the regular run-of-the-mill nonviolent cases, courts around the state are required to follow our sentencing guidelines.
So when he talks about outside the guidelines consist of a range of, in the state system, years or months. I think it's couched in terms of months.
Correct.
Where a judge is under a presumptive guideline setting would be required to impose a sentence between those 2 numbers.
Correct.
There are aggravating factors in cases that the prosecutors argue for, and there are mitigating factors that the defense argues for.
That's correct.
And somewhere in between those 2 extremes, we try to end up with a sentence that's similar in Jefferson County for the same behavior as it would be in Shelby County or in Chilton County or in Montgomery County.
That's right.
That's the goal.
Yes, sir.
It's not perfect and it doesn't always work, but it's certainly better than it has been, would you say?
Yes, there is no question that the sentencing guidelines have reduced the amount of unwarranted sentencing disparity across the state. There's no question about that.
Well, do you have some judges across the state that just say, I don't care what the guidelines say, this is what I'm going to do?
They typically will be appealed, and they'll typically lose in the Court of Criminal Appeals or the Alabama Supreme Court if, in fact, they have not gone through the proper legal mechanism, as you alluded to before, with consists of the state alleging aggravating factors and the defense arguing mitigating factors. If a judge just goes out on their own to do that, they will be appealed.
So, and it's important to remember that all of these guidelines result in numbers, generally speaking, that fall below the statutory maximum. Isn't that a fair statement?
That's true.
So you have to educate you, there's a statutory maximum punishment for every class of felony. And in Alabama, we have A, B, C, and D. I'm not going to go into what those ranges are, but as you move down the alphabet, the numbers get smaller. So that's a statutory maximum. A guideline is not the same as a statutory maximum. They're two different things. We're going to talk about some legislation that's ongoing in Montgomery when we come back from break. But we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with Bennett Wright. Don't go away. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. Bennett Wright's educating us on sentencing in the state of Alabama criminal justice system. So everybody knows we're incredibly dysfunctional in our prison system on many levels, not just capacity, but treatment of prisoners, medical care for prisoners. Let us know where we are with that issue, and funding of prisons, of course, is always a problem.
It's actually a huge issue. The state of Alabama has historically struggled with properly resourcing the prison system.
It's not a very popular cause to champion.
It is not.
Politically speaking.
It is very tough, politically speaking, to argue for new revenue streams or to divert existing revenue streams to go towards improving Alabama's prisons. Alabama's been kind of mired in federal litigation in the Middle District of Alabama, the Northern District of Alabama. One of the there's a bunch of issues, but some of the ones that we'll talk about today, we're struggling with prison conditions and our ability to provide a constitutional level of medical care. Both of those two issues are very, very expensive issues.
Well, part of Redemption Earn's cause is to deal with the medical infirmed that are being imprisoned, that are doing nothing but costing us tax dollars because of their lack of likelihood to reoffend at the age that they are at. We have two prisons that, our newest prison was built in 1997, and that is in Bibb County.
Yes, and so one of the big issues that the state has been garnered a lot of media attention is the state is currently constructing a new 4,000-bed male facility in Elmore County.
Yeah, but that's been going on since COVID. We're using COVID money to pay for it. Don't ask me how to connect the dots. I can't explain that.
The actual state used $400 million of the actual COVID money. So the Alabama prison population, one of the reasons such a vexing issue, Tommy, is that Alabama's prison population has actually fallen fairly dramatically. in 2011, 2012, Alabama had roughly 27,000 people.
That's what I thought it was now.
Incarcerated. It's actually 21,000.
Wow.
So there's 6,000 fewer people in prison today than in fact there were in 2012, but the costs have ballooned. And I think that one of the counterintuitive things that people really struggle with is, despite our prison population, the census going down, the associated costs are skyrocketing. And there are a couple of major issues why that is. Alabama has struggled with correctional officer staffing levels. The attrition rate of people that are hired as correctional officers runs about 80% within 3 years.
That's it?
So
They can't take it anymore?
Or most of them get better job opportunities with their local sheriff's departments or their local municipal police forces that pay significantly more money. So recently, Alabama correctional officers received a fairly large pay increase. When you're talking about economy of scale, we're talking that's a very large amount of money. Alabama's prisons themselves, as you just said, we have a very old infrastructure. If we didn't build any new prisons and we just remedied our existing our existing conditions in our prison facilities, it would cost upwards of $900 million just to update the state's existing 24 facilities. That would not add any extra space. That wouldn't improve on the design. That would just go into capital improvements, such as fixing roofs, floors, toilets, ovens, everything else. So the state's lack of historical investment is unfortunately becoming due at one time.
Well, the legislative body is in session as we are taping. I presume you're active in that effort to try to help remedy some of these problems. Do we have some legislation that's acceptable to our representatives and senators that might have a chance of passing?
Well, I think, so I had the fortune of serving as president and vice president of the National Association of Sentencing Commissions. I think what that really reinforced to me is that Alabama by far has the most complicated felony criminal justice system in really all of America. We have the courts that impose a sentence, and unless it's a split sentence, death sentence, or life without parole sentence, we then have a body, a 3-member body called the Alabama Parole Board, that ultimately determines when someone is released from really prison.
That has no oversight. Fair enough?
Their decisions cannot be appealed. That is correct.
Okay. Whatever they say
goes.
End of the show.
Correct. So while a lot of people say, well, we need to just change sentencing, you can change sentencing and still not affect the length of time that people serve in prison if the sentence itself isn't aligned with the decisions of the parole board, and vice versa. You cannot change sentencing, and the parole board can have people spend less time in prison or really more time in prison. So there's a lot of different decision points in really Alabama's system as really we go through. And you really mentioned the Alabama legislature. There was a bill dropped just last week that would increase the size of the parole board from 3 members to 5 members, and it would change how someone is selected as the chairman of that body. There's other proposals before the Alabama legislature that tinker with sentencing. There's a series of proposals with the Alabama legislature that would divert more funding towards substance abuse treatment, towards mental health treatment. So I think the approach is, they attempt to be a holistic approach. I think the hard thing is making sure all these policies align with each other to make sure we protect public safety, but at the same time, we get a handle around this big fiscal animal that really is the criminal justice system.
I want to talk about specific offenders in just a minute when we come back, because I have some trouble with a couple of issues relative to mental health. And I'm going to say the word that no one wants to hear, but sex offenders, because they're very difficult cases and very hard sentencings. This is Our Issues, Birmingham. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. We're talking about sentencing in Alabama and our criminal justice system. And as you can tell, it's quite complicated and complex, lots of moving parts. You use the expression legislation dropped. What does that mean? It failed or it was introduced?
Good question, sorry. When I said the legislation was dropped, it means that a particular legislature has introduced a piece of legislation for consideration.
Okay, so it's out there.
Yes, sir.
Where it goes, nobody knows.
That's correct.
Alabama is a state that doesn't recognize what I refer to as diminished capacity. In Alabama, you are either crazy, totally 100% insane, or you're fine. Correct?
That's correct.
There's no borderline personality, there's no schizophrenia, there's no bipolar, there's no major depressive disorders that qualify, that allow you to even talk about to a jury. They're considered sentencing factors. Do you foresee a day where Alabama will get into the, and we're not the only ones, it's a nationwide issue. Virginia's the only state that I've seen legislation that allows people to tell juries about mental states. If a crime is the combination of an act and a mental state and where they're converging, why is it that we can't talk about the mental state of the offender? And is there anybody that cares about trying to make some difference in that universe?
I would say that's not a topic that a lot of people are going to voluntarily raise on their own for really consideration.
I mean, would you agree with me? Reaching insanity in Alabama is an impossible bar to get over.
It's tough.
Very few.
Correct. It's very, very few.
And you would have to agree with me that there are people that are mentally ill and suffer from mental health disorders that commit crimes that arise from their mental health disorder, but yet nobody gets to know about it that's making decisions as to guilt or innocence.
Correct.
And I'm not talking about a free pass because you're bipolar,
Sure.
but I'm talking about some acknowledgement that it had a role in the commission of the offense. Why is that so hard for people to grasp?
I think with really any issue in the criminal justice system, what one person looks at is great, another person looks at is bad. And I think a lot of these issues that really we talk about, it's amazing the wide spectrum of reactions. What you just said is why can't that be considered? From really a legal perspective, in Alabama, we either say someone's competent to stand trial or they're not competent. And then what you just said is that what then can lawyers in the course of a trial, in conversation with the jury, what are you allowed to speak to the jury about as what are the issues that Bennett had present in his life at the time that I committed the crime of X?
That directly relate to the mental state, which is an element of the offense. Most crimes require some kind of mental state.
Sure.
Usually intentional, or reckless, or negligent.
Correct.
That's it.
Correct.
So if there's a mental health condition that affects the ability of that individual to form that intent, we should be able to talk about it and not ignore it.
I think the country in Alabama is slowly becoming more aware of the importance of mental health issues. I think that there's a very large educational component when we begin to talk about different elements of mental health. You talk about schizophrenia. Is it bipolar? Was it, you're going to get people say, well, that's great. Did Bennett have it at the time that he committed the offense? What was his history? Was he currently under medication under the time? And I think it's a really large educational component for really people to realize more about mental health, the different types of challenges that different mental health conditions, what those face an individual, and then how those components are integrated into criminal justice, and then even furthermore, what's allowable, what's not allowable in the course of a legal hearing.
A jury trial.
Correct.
What
Yes,
should a jury be able to hear?
That's correct.
It's very perplexing and it's very aggravating to me to be able to be allowed to even talk about it. Lastly, and we don't have a whole lot of time left, but sex offenders in Alabama, and I am not a proponent of sex offenders, but I do find it very difficult to believe that a person that gets publicly exposes himself at the swimming pool at the apartment complex is required to register and be subjected to the same requirements as somebody like Ted Bundy, who's a serial rapist murderer. In some states, there are tiers where the underlying conduct is considered, and not everybody is treated exactly the same. There are tiers of registration requirements. Do you ever foresee a day, and this is subject of litigation as well, and I know I'm talking a lot, but I'm passionate about these issues.
Sure.
Do you ever foresee a day where we get to a point where we recognize that not all sex offenders are predatory, or not all sex offenders are violent, not all sex offenses are the same?
Sure, and I really think you raised a really good point right there. It comes down to definitions, right? Is who's considered, quote, a sex offender, and what conduct is considered a sex offense. I think in Alabama, not just sex offense, but in a lot of other lists, what's considered a violent crime, a non-violent crime. When we get to these definitions, I think the inclination or the temptation is to add to the list. It's never the reverse. The reverse is rarely true, where we take things off a list. Traditionally, especially in political arenas, we tend to add to the list of things that are excluded or really subjected to really additional requirements, whether they be incarceration, supervision, basic provisions of some sort of supervision. So I think that's an ongoing conversation. As you mentioned, that's a subject of litigation. It has been a subject of national litigation. And I think the ongoing national conversation will result in probably some more conversations at the state level as well.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. It's gone by way too fast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something today about the complexities of the world of the criminal justice system, particularly in Alabama. This is Our Issues Birmingham, and we will see you next Sunday.